My best friend was actually a caregiver for some relatives in Charlie Kirk's family. Everything you heard about him is true and worse. He wasn't even an active father. I didn't want to write this when everything first happened, when the news broke, when timelines were flooded with tributes, when donations, merch, and think pieces started popping up everywhere. I stayed quiet. Part of that was exhaustion, part of it was disbelief, and part of it was knowing that anything said in the middle of a media storm gets flattened into sides. I didn't want to be another voice screaming into chaos. But now that the hype has died down, now that the shock has settled into something more performative, I can't keep watching people rewrite someone's life into a heroic myth without saying anything, especially when the version being celebrated looks nothing like what I've heard consistently, privately, and firsthand from someone I trust more than almost anyone. This isn't me claiming insider knowledge. I wasn't family, I wasn't famous, adjacent, I wasn't sitting in boardrooms or green rooms. What I do have is a best friend who worked as a caregiver for relatives connected to a very prominent political figure. She wasn't a fan, she wasn't a hater, she was there to do a job, care for someone vulnerable, and in the process she witnessed a family dynamic that was deeply unsettling. What bothers me most is how quickly death turned into absolution. How suddenly criticism became taboo, how a public image was treated as unquestionable truth while any suggestion of complexity or failure was dismissed as cruelty. I don't believe dying makes someone evil, but I also don't believe it automatically makes them good. I've watched people who never interacted with this family speak with absolute certainty about who this man was as a father, a husband, a human being. I've watched strangers insist they knew his heart because they consumed his content. Meanwhile, the people who actually lived around the consequences of his absence were invisible until they became useful for optics. This post isn't about politics, even though everything gets labeled that way. It's about hypocrisy. It's about the disconnect between what is projected and what happens behind closed doors. It's about how easily dysfunction gets ignored when the narrative is convenient. I'm not writing this to convince anyone. I'm writing it because staying silent started to feel like complicity, because watching a family profit off a tragedy while pretending there was no damage before it feels wrong. And because my friend, who had no NDA, no incentive, and nothing to gain, has carried these experiences quietly while the rest of the world applauded a story that never included her reality. So this is me finally saying something. Not to tear anyone down, but to remind people that public figures are not the same as private ones. And sometimes, the truth lives in the parts you were never meant to see. One of the things that has bothered me the most throughout all of this is how confidently people talk about him as a family man. It's said like a fact, repeated so often that it's treated as untouchable. Every tribute, every post, every speech leaned on that idea, that he was a devoted father first above everything else, but based on what my friend experienced while working closely with his extended family, that image doesn't line up with reality. What stands out to me is how often he simply wasn't there. Not busy for a week, absent, not caught up with work temporarily, absent, just consistently gone. According to my friend, his name was everywhere in the household, but his presence wasn't. Schedules revolved around his travel. Conversations referenced him constantly, yet he himself was more like a concept than a person who actively existed in the home. My friend worked there for a significant amount of time and never met him once. That fact alone keeps replaying in my head, not because meeting him would have changed anything, but because it says something about priorities. This wasn't a case of overlap issues or bad timing. He just wasn't home. There was always another event, another campus, another appearance, another business obligation. What frustrates me is knowing that his work didn't actually require him to be physically absent the way it was framed. So much of what he did could have been done remotely. Podcasts can be recorded from anywhere. Media appearances don't always demand constant travel, and yet, being gone seemed to be the default. The kids, from what my friend described, barely knew him in any meaningful way. Not in the way that builds trust or discipline or emotional safety, and that's what makes the sudden public emphasis on them feel uncomfortable to me. Before everything happened, they weren't visible. They weren't talked about, they weren't part of the public narrative. Then suddenly, they were everywhere. Symbols of loss, centerpieces of sympathy, woven into branding and messaging. I'm not saying grief isn't real. I'm not saying loss doesn't hurt. But I am saying that absence has consequences, and those consequences don't disappear just because someone dies. To me, being a father isn't about titles or intentions. It's about showing up, about being there in the mundane moments, the messy moments, the unglamorous ones. From what my friend saw, that kind of presence just wasn't happening, and it's hard to watch people praise a role that, behind closed doors, seems to have been largely symbolic. That disconnect between who people think he was and who he actually was to the people closest to him is what makes this so hard to swallow, because absence can be just as loud as neglect, even when it's wrapped in success and excuses. The one time my friend stepped inside the family's living space, it left an impression that never really faded. She didn't go in looking to judge. She wasn't there as a guest or a critic. She was there briefly out of necessity. But what she described to me afterward didn't sound like a home that was simply busy or temporarily overwhelmed. It sounded like a place where no one was fully tending to the basics. She told me the apartment felt chaotic in a way that suggested long-term neglect rather than a bad week. Boxes from online orders were stacked unopened, some of them clearly having sat there for a while. Not organized, not set aside, just abandoned. It gave the impression of people constantly acquiring things but never really settling into their own space. What bothered her most, though, was the condition of the walls. Crayon markings everywhere, not in a playful, contained way, but sprawling and unchecked. To some people, that might sound trivial. Kids draw, kids make messes. But what struck her, and what struck me when she described it, was that no one seemed to be correcting it, guiding it, or even noticing it. It felt less like childhood creativity, and more like children left to regulate themselves. She wasn't there to help raise kids, that wasn't her role, and she made that very clear. She was hired to care for an elderly relative. Still, she found herself being subtly, and sometimes not so subtle, pressured to step into responsibilities that weren't hers. There were moments when she was expected to watch the baby, soothe the baby, or help in ways she hadn't agreed to and wasn't trained for. Each time, she had to reassert her boundaries, which became exhausting. What stands out to me is that these expectations didn't come with gratitude or acknowledgement. They came with entitlement, as if her presence alone meant she should fill whatever gaps existed in the household, regardless of whether it was appropriate or safe. From the outside, this family was presented as polished and intentional. From the inside, according to my friend, it felt disorganized and emotionally thin. Adults seemed overwhelmed but unwilling to adjust. Children seemed undersupervised, and the absence of one central figure, the father everyone praised publicly, was felt in small, accumulating ways. I keep thinking about how homes tell the truth that public images try to hide. A home reflects priorities. It shows what gets attention and what doesn't, and from what my friend saw, this home didn't feel grounded or supported. It felt like everyone was running in different directions, hoping someone else would pick up the slack. Hearing all of this made the public narrative harder to accept, because while people were praising stability, leadership, and values, the reality my friend witnessed looked fragile, unmanaged, and quietly unraveling. And once you hear that kind of truth, it's impossible to unsee the cracks. When my friend talks about the relatives she worked for, there's a noticeable shift in her tone. It's not dramatic or exaggerated. It's tired, guarded, and very deliberate. Like someone choosing their words carefully because they've already spent enough time trying to make sense of behavior that never made sense in the first place. The person she was primarily responsible for caring for was, according to her, one of the most consistently hostile individuals she has ever encountered in a professional setting. Not difficult in the way illness can make someone irritable, but mean in a way that felt intentional. Conversations were laced with condescension. Small mistakes were treated like personal failures. Nothing my friend did ever seemed good enough, even when she was following instructions exactly as given. What unsettled her most was how normalized this behavior seemed within the household. No one corrected it, no one acknowledged it. It was just accepted as how she is. Over time, that kind of environment wears you down. My friend told me she started dreading going into work, not because of the caregiving itself, but because of the emotional toll of being constantly disrespected. Then there was the spouse. This is the part she hesitated the longest to tell me about, and I understand why. There was an incident that crossed a line so clearly that it shattered any sense of safety she had left in that job. While she was using the bathroom, with the door locked, he entered anyway, fully aware she was inside. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't confusion, it was a moment that made her feel exposed, violated, and powerless. After that, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't safe there anymore. No amount of professionalism or patience can compensate for fear. She didn't feel comfortable reporting it within the household, and she didn't feel protected by anyone connected to them. So she did the only thing she felt she could do. She quit. She walked away from the job not because she was irresponsible, but because staying would have meant ignoring her own instincts and boundaries. And that decision still weighs on her, not because she regrets leaving, but because of how little support she received in a situation that should never have happened. What makes this even harder for me to process is how invisible people like my friend are in stories like these. Caregivers don't get platforms. They don't get press releases or statements. They're expected to absorb dysfunction quietly and disappear when it becomes inconvenient. Hearing what she went through changed how I view the entire family dynamic. It revealed a pattern, not just of absence, but of entitlement and disregard for the people who were there to help. And once you recognize that pattern, it becomes impossible to separate it from the public image that's been so carefully curated. Because power doesn't just show in what people say publicly. It shows in how they treat those they believe no one is watching. This is the part that still makes my stomach turn, even now. Every time my friend talked about it, her voice would tighten in a way I didn't hear when she described anything else. Not anger exactly, more like disgust mixed with helplessness. Because this wasn't something she could rationalize away as stress, illness, or misunderstanding. It was neglect, plain and simple, and it happened in front of her. There were several dogs in the household, and according to my friend, they were treated less like living beings and more like inconvenient objects. When they were inside, they were yelled at constantly. Not corrected or trained, just shouted down, as if their existence alone was a nuisance. The dogs were anxious, skittish, and visibly unwell, which only seemed to make the adults more irritated with them. When the dogs became too annoying, or when no one felt like dealing with them, they were put outside, and not in a thoughtful, temporary way. They were tied up and left there for hours in extreme Arizona heat. Sometimes all day. My friend said there were times when they had no access to water, no real shade, just a small patch where they could try to escape the sun. She described watching them limp toward whatever sliver of shadow they could find, exhausted and overheated. What struck her most was how normal this seemed to the people living there. No one expressed concern, no one checked on them regularly. It wasn't framed as cruelty. It was framed as inconvenience management. The dogs were something to be dealt with when someone remembered they existed. The smell was apparently overwhelming, a mix of waste, heat, and neglect that clung to everything. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was a sign that basic care wasn't happening. And while some people might dismiss this as exaggeration or claim it's just how pets are sometimes, my friend was very clear. This went far beyond occasional neglect or a bad day. Hearing this shook me in a way the other stories hadn't. Because animals don't benefit from image management, they don't understand politics or public narratives. How people treat animals, especially when no one is watching, says a lot about their capacity for empathy. What makes it worse is knowing that my friend had no authority to intervene. She wasn't their owner. She wasn't in a position of power. All she could do was quietly care when she could and carry the guilt of knowing it wasn't enough. When people talk about values, morals, and righteousness, I can't help but think about those dogs, about how easy it is to speak loudly about principles while failing the most basic test of compassion at home. And for me, that contradiction is impossible to ignore, because sometimes the truth about a household isn't revealed in speeches or beliefs. It's revealed in how it treats the ones who can't speak for themselves. What keeps pulling me back to all of this isn't anger, it's frustration. A slow, gnawing frustration that comes from watching a story be simplified until it no longer resembles reality. After everything I've heard, after everything my friend experienced, it's hard for me to accept how quickly the public decided what this family's story was supposed to mean. Once the shock passed, something else took its place. Fundraisers, merchandise, carefully worded statements, symbolic moments designed to be shared, liked, and amplified. Grief became public, facing, polished, and, whether intentionally or not profitable. And every time I saw it, I felt more uneasy. I want to be clear, I don't think people shouldn't grieve. I don't think tragedy should be hidden or minimized, but there's a difference between mourning and myth-making. There's a difference between honoring someone and refusing to acknowledge that they were complicated, flawed, or even harmful in ways that didn't fit the narrative. What bothers me most is how quickly criticism was reframed as cruelty. Any attempt to question the image was shut down with moral outrage. It became easier to defend a symbol than to sit with uncomfortable truths, and that silence, the kind that's enforced by social pressure, protects systems and people who benefit from it. My friend gained nothing from what she went through, no recognition, no compensation beyond a paycheck that didn't justify the emotional cost. She left quietly, carrying experiences that still affect her, while the family continued on, untouched by accountability. Watching that contrast play out publicly feels deeply unfair. This matters because it reveals how power works. Public figures are insulated not just by money or influence, but by stories that people want to believe because they're cleaner, more inspiring, and easier to digest. Stories that don't include caregivers, domestic workers, or anyone who sees behind the curtain. It also matters because absence, neglect, and entitlement don't always leave visible scars. Sometimes they show up as emotional distance, unmanaged households, or people quietly leaving jobs because staying feels unsafe. Those experiences don't make headlines, but they're real. I don't expect this perspective to be welcomed. I know it makes people uncomfortable, but discomfort isn't the same as harm, and pretending dysfunction didn't exist doesn't undo the impact it had on the people who lived with it. For me, this isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about resisting the urge to sanitize reality just because the truth complicates a convenient narrative. Because if we only allow perfect stories after someone is gone, we erase the people who were affected long before the ending. And I refuse to believe that silence is the price of being respectful. I keep coming back to the same thought, how little we actually know about the people we feel so certain about. We consume fragments, clips, quotes, headlines, carefully curated moments, and somehow convince ourselves that adds up to a full human being. It doesn't, it never has. What this entire experience has taught me is how powerful distance can be. Distance allows us to project meaning onto people we've never met. It allows us to ignore the quiet, unglamorous truths that don't fit the story we prefer. And it allows us to believe that public virtue always reflects private behavior, even when there's no real evidence that it does. I'm not claiming I have the whole truth. I don't. No one does. What I have is a perspective shaped by listening, really listening, to someone who is close enough to see the cracks but powerless enough to do anything about them. That kind of proximity doesn't come with certainty, but it does come with clarity. What frustrates me is how aggressively people resist that kind of nuance. We want heroes or villains, nothing in between. We want clean endings and moral closure. So when someone dies, especially someone with influence, we rush to freeze them in their best light and seal the image shut. Anyone who suggests otherwise is treated like they're attacking grief itself. But grief doesn't require dishonesty, respect doesn't require erasure, and acknowledging harm doesn't cancel out loss. It just makes room for the full picture. I think about how many people like my friend exist on the edges of powerful families and public figures. Caregivers, assistants, aides, employees. People who see what happens when the cameras are off and the speeches are over. They rarely speak, not because they're lying, but because no one wants to hear from them unless their story is flattering. That silence is part of the system. It protects reputations, it smooths over discomfort, and it teaches people that their experiences don't matter unless they align with the narrative already in place. I don't expect everyone to agree with me. I don't even expect people to believe me. What I hope, maybe naively, is that this makes someone pause before turning a human being into a symbol, before assuming they know the full story, before dismissing voices simply because they complicate things, because real life is complicated, families are messy, power distorts behavior, and public images are often the least honest part of a person. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the truth usually lives in the spaces we're told not to look, in the quiet departures, in the stories shared privately, without platforms or profit. And once you've heard those stories, it becomes impossible to pretend that what you see on the surface is all there is. This is me choosing not to pretend anymore.